Welcome to the Asia and the Pacific Policy Conference 2014, hosted by the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. I'm Belinda Thompson. With me today is Sharmina Saili, who is the Regional Planning Advisor for the Pacific Islands Forum. Sharmina, can you tell me a little bit about your role at the Pacific Islands Forum?
Well, I'm the Regional Planning Advisor, and what I do is mainly we work with countries to help strengthen national planning, budgeting and public financial management processes, as well as link those to aid management processes as well. So the idea is really to help countries to make sure that all the resources that the country has are optimally used. So we're looking at trying to link the national development plans with the budgets, make sure that they're channeled through strong public financial management systems so there's accountability and monitoring of resources and results, as well as making sure that all the aid or the ODA and support from development partners that come into the countries are sort of on budget, aligned to national priorities.
So overseas development aid is a huge proportion of the money that comes into the Pacific Islands, and yet only about 35% of it goes through country partners. Is this a problem, and why?
Right. Well, it is a problem not just in the Pacific, but also globally. But I think it's particularly quite important to look at it in the Pacific because we have very small administrations, sort of public administrations in the Pacific, and I think it's very important that the resources that come in to the Pacific countries are sort of channeled and they use the country's public financial management systems. Because if you set up parallel systems, which is often the case now, of channeling resources through other mechanisms rather than through the country systems, it continues to weaken the country systems of the Pacific Island countries. And at the same time, you don't see the entire envelope of resources that you have at your disposal. So not only do you not have a full idea of what all the resources are, but you also do not have a good idea of how then you monitor all those resources and also account for those resources and make sure that the gaps are addressed as well.
So when you start looking at overseas development aid, why is national leadership about priorities essential?
I think it's quite essential because development partners mean well. They want to help. But often in some cases, not just in the Pacific, but also globally, some of the help that's provided is not sort of relevant. It's duplicative of other support that's being provided. And sometimes it's not actually aligned to the priorities of government. So I think it's quite important that the Pacific countries take strong ownership and leadership of their own development agenda by, first of all, identifying themselves what their priorities are and then articulating those and then working with the development partners to make sure that all the resources and the support that's provided by the development partners are actually supporting the priorities of the governments in the Pacific. So I think it's the first step in terms of making sure that aid is well used in the Pacific.
So during the conference, you talked about an example where a donor had asked for a 1,500-page report before they would proceed in a country that only had 2 planning staff.
Yes.
Is that typical that donors don't really understand the constraints and are setting expectations that are unrealistic?
Yes, I think I use that example to illustrate the complexity of some of the procedures and processes of some of the development partners. And yes, some of the expectations are too high and do not really fit the smallness and the capacities of the Pacific countries. And I think it's not just here in the Pacific, it's also in a lot of the other developing countries, but I keep emphasizing that in the Pacific that we have very small public administrations and very limited capacities. Like that example I used where there were only 2 people in planning, and yet for a project proposal that was worth maybe about 100,000. There was quite a lot of requirements for approval of the project. And it took about 1,500 pages essentially, which I think is very unrealistic, and it needs to change.
Part of what we also talked about through the conference was the Sustainable Development Goals, which will replace the Millennium Development Goals from 2015 to 2030. Now, you mentioned about there being 169 targets. How realistic is it for those targets to be reported on, let alone achieved by some of the smaller Pacific Island nations?
Yes, I think we can learn from the experience of the Millennium Development Goals. We're already struggling in the Pacific to monitor 8 goals and about 60 indicators and about 18 to 19 targets. If you're looking at 169 targets, that's an enormous increase in the number of targets that we have to consider, let alone try and implement and then monitor. So if you're looking at 169 targets, you're essentially possibly looking at about 400 indicators, which is absolutely, it's way too much for the Pacific to look at monitoring appropriately. So I think the international community needs to look at the special cases of the small island developing states, particularly here in the Pacific, where we really struggle with data, quality of data is also, and also the availability of data is also quite an issue. So we are concerned about the 169 targets, and we're hoping that the global community as well as the Pacific can, influence the global discussions on the SDGs before they're finalized. I know the final negotiation starts in January next year, so I'm hopeful that they can start to maybe minimize or streamline and reduce the number of targets. But in the end, it's up to the Pacific what we think is relevant to us. And also the most important thing is that national governments at the national level need to identify what are their priorities, what are the targets and indicators they want to monitor based on their own development context, and then measure their progress accordingly. And also in the Pacific, we also need to look at what are the relevant global targets and indicators that are relevant to us. And if they're not relevant, then maybe we tailor them as well and simplify and make sure that we do have the capacity to also monitor this.
Thank you so much for your time, Shamina. That
You're
was
most
great.
welcome.